And then what we can eke out from the history is honestly worth all the rest and then some. Even though many of these accounts are highly legendary, the figure central to Christianity, Jesus of Nazareth, most likely was a historical itinerant rabbi, and that much of his moral teaching that we do have in the Gospels are radically altruistic, universal and revolutionary, and that he and John the Baptist began a tradition of resistance to oppression and martyrdom that has gone on to inspire most of the world. In fact, if you include those thinkers, teachers, and activists from the Enlightenment who were inspired by his teaching and example, and let's also say Marx, Muhammad, and heck, even Gandhi is part of the Jesus tradition, which I think you should, although I'm sure that's a case to make for a different video. He's proven to be the most influential figure in history. There's also something to be said that the early Christians who were from a largely illiterate, poor, marginalized, and oppressed community were so inspired to create oral traditions and then eventually write so much literature around the central figure. Scholars estimate that there were between 40 and 60 ancient texts that were referred to as Gospels. So no wonder they're not perfect, but also they're remarkably unique pieces of literature in ancient history. Despite the Gospel of Matthew's assertion that Jesus wants his followers to maintain the old law, most of what we are told about his message suggests that he was actively rebelling against the temple cult and their gatekeeping of sacrificial atonement for sins, as opposed to his preaching of a direct forgiveness for sins from God. And he also often seems to be critical of over-legalistic interpretations of Scripture. In another passage from Matthew's Gospel, 22:34, one of the Pharisees, who was an expert in the Hebrew law, asked Jesus what the greatest commandment in the law is. Jesus' reply was twofold. He said that the greatest commandment was to love God with all your heart and all your soul and all your mind. This is rooted in the ancient Hebrew prayer known as the Shema, found in Deuteronomy 6:5. He emphasized that the second greatest commandment is like the first, to love your neighbor as yourself, found in Leviticus 19:18. He then said that all the law and the prophets hang on these two commandments. Whereas in his Jewish tradition, your neighbor is your fellow Jew, Jesus' message gradually becomes universalized as perturbed by his apocalypticism. In the teaching of the goats and the sheep, for instance, in Matthew 25:31 through 46, Jesus describes the end times, where he says a figure he calls the Son of Man and angels will come to judge all nations, not just the nation of Israel, aka Jesus' race, Jewish folks, but all peoples. This Son of Man separates people for inclusion in his new kingdom based not on their race or adherence to the old law, but based on their behavior towards each other. While the Son of Man uses himself as the metric in his teaching, he is also described here as a king and is identified with Jesus in his own perceived messianic destiny. The Messiah was supposed to be a prophesied leader anointed with oil, a king. He says that this king will separate the sheep from the goats, one on his right hand and one on his left. The ones on his right hand are blessed because when he, the king, was hungry, they fed him. When he was thirsty, they gave him drink. When he was a stranger, they welcomed him. When he was naked, they clothed him. When they took care of him when he was sick and visited him when he was imprisoned. So this is an apocalyptic king that suddenly crashes into these sheep's lives and is praising them for how well they treated him, to which they basically say, wait, Lord, when was all of this? We literally just met you. Here the king replies, just as you did it to the least of these brothers and sisters of mine, you did it to me. This lesson is repeated in the inverse for the goats on the left side of the king. The goats did not take care of their brothers and sisters in trouble, so they did not take care of the king. While the parable is a bit shoehorned in there, another thing Jesus was known for, the message is clear. This goes far beyond the golden rule. If you don't treat those on the margins of society the same as this salvational king, he says, you who are accursed, depart from me into the eternal fire prepared for the devil and his angels. Which, even though it sounds like it, I also don't believe that that fire is hell. I don't believe Jesus believed in hell or that the concept had been developed yet. But again, maybe that's for another video. These are the key ethical teachings of the central figure of Christianity, and they fit the treatment of gay and trans individuals by Christians like a glove. Think back to the AIDS crisis. Which modern Christians are the sheep and which are the goats when it comes to queer folks? Now, don't get me wrong. Does any of this mean that these ancient first century Jews or early Christians were woke or accepting of LGBTQI and all of that? No. Jesus didn't say anything at all about gay people that we know of. But for good or ill, he had a very good excuse.